The garage smelled of cedar dust, old motor oil, and the sharp, metallic tongue of rain that wouldn't stop falling. It was a November Tuesday in Portland, the kind of evening that felt like it had been dark since noon. Mark ran his hand over a piece of white oak clamped to his workbench. It was smooth, sanded to a 200 grit finish, perfect and cold. To anyone else, it was just a plank of wood, but to Mark, it was a solved problem. He was a Finnish carpenter by trade. His life was dictated by the laws of physics and the reliability of measurements. He understood how things fit together. He found comfort in the absolute certainty of a joinery technique. He stared at the wood, thinking about the tensile strength of the grain. If you cut the angles right, the wood locked into place. It held itself together against gravity, against pressure, against time. It was a simple, solvable geometry. What he didn't understand, what he couldn't measure or sand down or clamp into submission, was the silence in his own kitchen. It had been 14 months since Sarah died. An aneurysm. The doctor had used words like catastrophic and instant, clinical terms that failed to capture the violence of the event. It was a thief in the night that had stolen the noise from the house. It took the humming she did while chopping cilantro, the clinking of wine glasses on the granite counter, the frantic, laughing search for her keys every morning. Now the house was quiet. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, pressurized vacuum, filled only by the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic thumping of a 7-year-old feet upstairs. Mark checked his watch, 6:15 p.m., dinner time. He wiped his hands on his shop rag, meticulously cleaning each finger. He turned off the shop lights, plunging the sanctuary of the garage into darkness, and walked toward the door that led inside. He paused with his hand on the knob. He always paused. He had to steel himself for the warmth, for the smell of the house that was starting to lose her scent, replaced by the sterile odor of cleaning products and bachelorhood. He opened the door. The transition from the cold garage to the warm kitchen fogged his glasses immediately. He took them off, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his palm, feeling the grit of sawdust against his skin. He called out, his voice sounded too loud in the empty room. "Time to wash up." "I'm making tacos." "Tacos again?" The voice drifted down from the second floor, small and muffled. Mark winced, pulling a pound of ground beef from the fridge. It was Tuesday. Sarah used to make Thai curry on Tuesdays. She would blast 80s pop music and dance around the island with a wooden spoon. The air thick with coconut milk and lemongrass. Mark had tried to make it once, a month after the funeral. He had burned the paste and made it so spicy Leo had cried. They hadn't tried again. "It's Taco Tuesday, buddy," Mark shouted back, dropping the meat into the skillet. The sizzle was aggressive, filling the silence. "It's the law," he heard the thumping get louder. Leo came down the stairs, dragging his feet. He was small for 7, a collection of sharp elbows and knees. He had Sarah's unruly, dark hair that refused to be combed, and Mark's serious, brooding chin. He was wearing a t-shirt that was slightly too big, making him look even smaller. Leo didn't come to the counter. He stood by the doorway, holding a piece of crumpled bright orange paper against his chest. "Look," Leo said, walking forward and thrusting the paper at Mark's belt buckle. Mark turned the heat down on the stove and unfolded the paper. It was a flyer for the elementary school's winter derby, the graphic. Design was a chaotic mess of clip art cars and explosion graphics. "Build memories. Build speed. Build together." The flyer screamed in Comic Sans, Washington Park Soapbox Race, December 12th. Mark felt a physical tightening in his chest, a familiar constriction that happened whenever he was asked to perform the role of fun parent. When he was barely managing the role of a live parent, the flyer was asking for enthusiasm. It was asking for energy. It was asking for a father who wasn't hollowed out. "Leo? A race, huh?" Mark asked, his voice neutral. He turned back to the stove to break up the beef, avoiding Leo's eyes. "Tommy's dad is building one with flames," Leo said, climbing onto a bar stool. His voice picked up speed, a rare spark of excitement cutting through the gloom. "And Mr. Henderson is an engineer, so he said his car is going to be aerodynamic." "Aerodynamic," Mark repeated, stirring the meat. "That's a big word. Can we build one?" Leo asked. The question hung in the air, fragile and heavy. Mark looked at the grease popping in the pan. He was so tired. His back ached from installing crown molding in a high-rise all day. The laundry was piled high on the sofa, a mountain of clothes he didn't have the will to fold. The emotional bandwidth required to design, build, and race a car felt like trying to climb Everest in flip-flops. He just wanted to eat the tacos, check the homework, and go to sleep so he could work again tomorrow. "Leo, I don't know," Mark said, keeping his back to the boy. "I've got that big job in the Pearl District starting next week. The timeline is tight. I'm going to be working late." The silence returned, instant and suffocating. The sizzling of the meat seemed to stop. "But you build stuff," Leo said. His voice had dropped an octave. It wasn't a plea anymore. It was a confusion. "You build everything." "Mom said you could fix the sky if it cracked." Mark gripped the spatula so hard his knuckles turned white. Sarah had said that. She used to say it when he worried about money or the mortgage or the leak in the roof during the rainy season. She would wrap her arms around his waist, rest her head on his shoulder, and whisper, "Mark, you're the solid one. You can fix the sky if it cracks," but the sky had cracked. It had shattered into a million pieces on a Tuesday afternoon 14 months ago, and all his tools, all his dovetail joints and structural calculations hadn't been able to fix it. Mark turned around slowly. Leo was looking at his knees, picking at a loose thread on his jeans. He looked lonely. Not just bored, but fundamentally, structurally lonely. He was a boy living in a house with a ghost and a machine. Mark looked at the orange flyer on the counter, "Build Together." He realized then that he had been building things to keep the world out. He had been retreating to the garage to control his environment. But Leo was out here, in the kitchen, unprotected. Mark let out a long, shuddering breath. He took his glasses off again and wiped them on his shirt. "Okay," Mark said softly. Leo's head snapped up. His eyes were wide, two pools of brown reflecting the kitchen lights. "Okay, we'll build a car." "But not just any car," Mark said. He leaned in, resting his elbows on the quartz counter, channeling a bravado he didn't feel, forcing himself to bridge the gap between them. "I'm a carpenter, Leo. We don't build junk. We're going to build the fastest piece of wood on four wheels this town has ever seen. If you or someone you know is struggling with grief, remember that it's okay to ask for help. Resources like the Grief Recovery Hotline are available, and support is just a phone call away. You are not alone." Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story. Being a perfectionist carpenter is a curse. You can't just nail some boards together and call it a day. Not when your brain is wired to see every fatal flaw, every potential warp, every weak joint. So, 3 nights later, our kitchen table, normally a battlefield of junk mail and my son Leo's half-eaten cereal bowls, had transformed into a war room. It was buried under graph paper, rulers, and spec sheets I'd printed off the internet. I was hunched over, sketching with a mechanical pencil, the lead scratching rhythmically. I wasn't just drawing a toy, I was designing a vessel. I was calculating the wheelbase, the center of gravity, the caster angle. Everything to ensure this thing was safe and handled perfectly. I muttered to myself, "We need a chassis made of laminated plywood, not solid stock." I tapped the eraser on my chin. Solid wood splits under vibration. Plywood distributes the stress. If we use solid axles with a drop point, we can lower the center of gravity by 2 inches. Across from me, Leo was kicking the chair leg. Thump, 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 thump. It was starting to get on my nerves. He wasn't drawing schematics. He was armed with a box of crayons and a total lack of respect for the laws of physics. "Dad," he said. "Hang on, bud." "I'm figuring out the steering ratio," I replied, not looking up. "If it's too tight, you'll flip. Too loose, and you won't make the corner at the bottom of the hill. It's a math problem." "Dad." "What?" I snapped, finally looking up. A headache was starting to pulse behind my eyes. Leo held up his drawing. It was aggressive. It was chaotic. It was a vehicle that looked less like a car and more like a shark that had swallowed a lightning bolt. And it was blindingly yellow. "I want it to be yellow," he declared. I looked at his drawing, then back at my precise black and white blueprints. "Yellow shows the dirt, Leo. And cheap spray paint chips," I pointed to my own drawing. "I was thinking a nice mahogany stain. We'll seal it with 3 coats of marine-grade polyurethane. It'll look classy. Like an old boat." "I don't want a boat." Leo said, his lower lip jutting out. It was a look he got from his mother, Sarah, when she didn't get her way. I want a yellow shark. Sharks are fast. I stared at that yellow crayon. Sarah had loved yellow. Our kitchen walls used to be a soft, buttery yellow. It was the first thing I changed after she was gone. I painted them a dull gray in a frantic weekend, telling myself it was to increase the resale value, but really the yellow just hurt to look at. It was too bright for the gray life I was now living. We'll see about the paint, I said, my voice firm. It was my classic parental veto disguised as procrastination. Let's focus on the frame first. The paint doesn't matter if the car falls apart. So we moved into the garage. I flipped the switch, and the fluorescent lights hummed to life, bathing my workshop in a cool glow. This was my sanctuary. The smell of sawdust and WD-40 was my incense. I set up the table saw, adjusting the fence with a micrometer. I measured the sheet of plywood. Then I measured it again. Safety goggles, I commanded. Leo put them on. They swallowed his face, making him look like a tiny, confused deep-sea diver. I fired up the saw. The machine screamed, a high-pitched whine that vibrated in our teeth. I moved the wood through the blade with a practiced, fluid motion. In here, I was in my element. I wasn't a widower. I was a craftsman. I cut the chassis, the bulkheads, the supports, every cut perfectly square. But Leo was just standing there, shifting his weight. He touched a screwdriver. He spun the vice handle. "Can I saw?" he shouted over the noise. "No, it's dangerous," I said, my eyes glued to the spinning blade. "Keep your hands behind your back." I finished the cut and powered down the saw. The silence rushed back in, ringing in our ears. "Can I hammer?" Leo asked, his voice full of hope. "Not on the frame, Leo. We're using screws and wood glue for a stronger bond. Hammering will dent the wood." "Then what can I do?" he yelled, throwing his hands up. The oversized goggles slipped down his nose. "You're doing everything." I froze. I looked at my son, standing there looking so small and useless amidst all my expensive tools and neat piles of sawdust, and it hit me with a pang of guilt. I was doing it again. I was managing the project, not the relationship. I was building a car asterisk for asterisk him to protect him, to make sure he didn't crash or look foolish. I wasn't building it asterisk with asterisk him, but letting him help? That meant letting go. It meant crooked cuts. It meant wasted wood. It meant losing control. "Sand," I said finally, grabbing a block of 120 grit paper. I handed it to him like it was a peace offering. "You can sand the edges of the chassis. They need to be soft so you don't get splinters." Leo took the block, looking at it skeptically. "Just rub the wood?" "With the grain," I corrected automatically. "Always with the grain." He started sanding. The soft she filled the quiet garage. But after about 4 minutes, the rhythm faltered. He stopped. He wandered over to a corner where a spider was building a web between a rake and a shovel. I watched him go. I wanted to call him back, to demand focus, to explain that discipline is how you build things that last. But I didn't. I turned back to the workbench, picked up my drill, and began pre-drilling the pilot holes for the screws. I worked for 3 more hours. Leo eventually went inside, had some cereal, and went to bed without saying goodnight. I stayed in the garage until midnight. I assembled the entire frame. It was a masterpiece of joinery, perfectly square, incredibly rigid, and smooth as glass. I ran my hand over the curve of the side panel. It was exactly what I had drawn on the paper. It was safe, it was strong. And as I turned off the lights, leaving the perfect, pale skeleton of the car sitting there in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that all I had built was a beautiful, empty box. This story is just beginning to unfold. If you've ever felt that pull between perfection and connection, you'll want to see what happens next. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next part of our journey. Thanks for watching. 2 weeks vanished into a haze of sawdust and restless nights. The soapbox car was no longer a pile of wood. It was transforming, becoming something sleek and beautiful, something that looked like it belonged in a wind tunnel, not a garage. The white oak grain flowed smoothly from nose to tail, broken only by the cockpit. It was a Saturday, just 1 week before the race. The Portland weather had turned sour, a miserable mix of ice and slush coating the driveway. Inside the garage, a small space heater buzzed, fighting a losing war against the damp chill. Mark wiped sweat from his brow, even though it was cold. He was kneeling beside the car, wrench in hand. "Okay, steering test," he said, his voice tense. "Focus, Leo. This is critical." Mark hadn't used a simple rope and pulley system like the other dads. No, he'd engineered a complex, closed-loop cable system with aircraft-grade wire. It was brilliant, over-engineered, and totally unnecessary for a 7-year-old. Leo climbed into the cockpit, looking small and swallowed by the wooden frame. The serious motorcycle helmet Mark bought him bobbled on his shoulders. "Put your hands on the butterfly wheel," Mark instructed. "I've set the tension high to prevent wobbles. It's going to require intent." Leo gripped the custom-carved steering yoke. "It feels tight, Dad, like stuck." "It's not stuck. It's precise," Mark corrected, twisting a turnbuckle. "Zero play in the system. That's what you want. Now turn left, hard." Leo bit his lip and leaned his whole body into the turn, yanking the wheel with both hands. Snap! The sound was like a gunshot in the garage. The tension had been too much. The braided wire sheared right at the crimp point. The released energy whipped the steel cable backward like a snake lashing out. It missed Leo's face by inches thanks to the helmet, but the jagged metal end raked across the dashboard. It carved a deep, ugly gouge into the wood Mark had spent 3 hours sanding and polishing just the night before. "No!" Mark's shout was raw, echoing off the concrete walls. Without thinking, he threw the wrench. It flew across the garage, slamming into the workbench with a deafening clang. A jar of screws crashed to the floor. Leo shrank back into the seat, pulling his knees to his chest. He looked terrified. "I told you not to yank it," Mark snapped, looming over the car. The frustration boiled over, hot and blinding. He knew it wasn't about the cable, but he couldn't stop the avalanche. It was about the laundry pile that had toppled over that morning. It was about the overdue electric bill. It was about the empty side of the bed that felt colder every night. It was about the crushing realization that he was doing this all by himself and he was failing. "I didn't mean to," Leo whispered, his voice trembling inside the helmet. Tears welled up behind the visor. "Just get out," Mark said, his voice a harsh whisper. He rubbed his face, trying to push the rage down, but his hands were shaking. "Go inside, Leo. I have to fix this. I can't." "Just go?" Leo scrambled out of the car. He tripped, caught himself, and ran toward the house without looking back. The door slammed shut, shaking the tools on the wall. Mark stood alone in the garage. The silence that followed felt heavy, judgmental. He looked down at the car. The scratch on the dashboard was a stark white scar against the honey-colored oak. He saw the frayed end of the snapped cable, dangling uselessly. The adrenaline drained out of him, leaving him hollow. His knees gave way. He sank to the cold concrete floor, leaning his back against the tire of his truck. He pulled his knees up, buried his face in his sawdust-covered hands, and he wept. It wasn't a graceful cry. It was the ugly, silent sob of a man who'd been holding up a ceiling that was far too heavy for far too long. His shoulders shook violently as he gasped for air. He missed her. God, he missed her so much it felt like a physical wound. Sarah would have laughed at the snapped cable. She would have made a joke about Leo's Hulk strength. She'd have found a goofy sticker and slapped it right over the scratch. "There," she would have said. "Now it has character." She would have made hot chocolate with too many marshmallows and everything would have been okay. But Sarah wasn't here. It was just Mark, the broken cable, and the scratched wood. He sat there for 20 minutes, the cold seeping into his bones. Eventually the tears stopped. He took a deep, shuddering breath and wiped his face with his sleeve. He looked at the broken steering mechanism. His every instinct screamed at him to get up, get the tools, and fix it. Make it perfect again, erase the mistake. But he didn't. He looked at the wrench on the floor. He looked at the door where his son had fled. Slowly, Mark stood up. He turned off the space heater. He flicked the light switch, leaving the broken car in the dark. For the first time in his life, he left something broken. He walked to the door, steadied his shaking hands, and went into the house. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It wasn't just empty, it was bruised. The echo of the slamming door seemed to hang in the hallway air like smoke. Mark washed his hands in the kitchen sink, scrubbing until the skin was raw, trying to wash off the garage grease and the guilt. He dried them on a dish towel and walked up the stairs. The third step creaked. Sarah used to say that step was the house saying hello. Tonight, it just sounded like an accusation. He reached Leo's room. The door was cracked open a few inches, revealing a slice of darkness. Mark pushed it open gently. The room smelled of dirty socks and faint strawberry shampoo. Leo was lying on his bed, curled into a tight ball facing the wall. In the dim light from the hallway, Mark saw what Leo was holding. It was the framed photo from the living room mantel, the one of Sarah from their trip to the coast, windblown and laughing. Mark knocked gently on the doorframe. "Leo?" No answer. Just the small, rhythmic rise and fall of his shoulders. Mark walked in, navigating the minefield of Lego bricks scattered on the carpet. He sat on the edge of the twin bed. The mattress dipped under his weight, pulling Leo slightly toward him, but the boy didn't uncurl. "I'm sorry I yelled," Mark said into the gloom. His voice was rough. "I'm not mad at you, I promise. I'm just tired. The cable snapping scared me." "I didn't want you to get hurt." Leo turned over slowly. In the shadows, his eyes were red and puffy. He clutched the frame to his chest like a shield. "Mom wouldn't have yelled," Leo said. The words hit Mark like a physical blow to the sternum. It was the absolute, unvarnished truth, delivered with the devastating clarity of a 7-year-old. Mark felt a defensive excuse rise in his throat. She didn't have to worry about the mortgage. She didn't have to carry it all alone, but he swallowed it down. He took a breath, letting the shame settle. "You're right," Mark whispered. "She wouldn't have. She was patient. She was the best at being patient. I'm still learning how to be like her." Leo looked down at the photo, tracing his thumb over the glass. "Do you think she can see the car?" "I don't know," Mark admitted. He wasn't religious, but he wasn't an atheist anymore either. Grief makes you agnostic. You hope for everything and expect nothing. "But if she can, I know she'd want us to finish it." Leo sat up, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "I don't want it to be wood-colored," he said, his voice trembling but defiant. "It looks like furniture." "Mom didn't like brown furniture. She liked colors." Mark looked around Leo's room. It was chaos, a riot of primary colors, posters, and plastic toys. Then he thought about his garage, the perfect dovetail joints, the sterile, sanded surfaces, the obsession with geometry. He realized he hadn't been building a race car. He had been building a coffee table on wheels. He was trying to control the world through clean lines because his emotional world was a mess. "You're right," Mark said, a small, genuine smile cracking the mask of his exhaustion. "It looks like a library desk." Leo cracked a small, watery smile. "Yeah, it's boring. Tomorrow," Mark said, reaching out and squeezing Leo's shoulder, feeling the small bones beneath the t-shirt. "We paint. And not that tasteful navy blue lacquer I bought." "Sunburst yellow?" Leo asked, hopeful. Mark nodded. "Sunburst yellow, the brightest we can find?" With a shark mouth, the next day, perfection died and fun was finally born. They didn't prep the wood properly. They didn't use a primer. They didn't sand the grain to 400 grit. They went to the hardware store and bought 3 cans of safety yellow, the kind used for road signs and hazard warnings, because it was the most obnoxious color on the shelf. Back in the garage, Mark opened the main door to let the fumes escape. The rain had stopped, leaving a crisp, cold Sunday morning. "Shake it up," Mark said. They shook the cans, the clack, clack, clack of the mixing balls creating a new rhythm in the workshop. "Okay," Mark said, handing a can to Leo. "Go for it." "Really?" Leo asked. "I can't mess it up?" "It's spray paint, bud. If you mess it up, we just spray more over it." Leo held the trigger down. He didn't do the sweeping, even strokes Mark would have done. He held it in one spot. The paint hissed, coating the beautiful white oak in thick, neon sludge. It pooled. It began to run down the side of the car like melting butter, forming heavy, yellow tears. "It's dripping!" Leo laughed, looking at Mark with wide eyes. Mark looked at the drips. His inner craftsman screamed. The run would take days to cure properly. It was uneven. It was amateur. "It adds texture for speed," Mark lied, grinning. He grabbed another can. "Aerodynamic ridges." They painted the whole thing. The fumes smelled like chemicals and freedom. Mark got yellow paint on his work boots. Leo got a smudge of yellow in his hair. They painted the wheels matte black to contrast. When the base coat was tacky, Mark retrieved his fine detail brushes, the expensive sable ones he used for antique restoration. He dipped one into a tin of black enamel. "Okay," Mark said. "Shark mouth and eyes, angry eyes," Leo commanded. Mark painted a jagged mouth on the nose of the car. It wasn't symmetrical, the teeth were crooked, but it looked ferocious. It looked like a car that wanted to eat the road. While the paint dried, sticky and smelling of solvents, Mark fixed the steering. He threw the high-tension aircraft cable into the trash. Instead, he used a thick, braided nylon rope and a simple pulley system. "Try this," Mark said. Leo turned the wheel. It was loose, it had slop. But when he turned it hard, the rope held. It stretched slightly, absorbing the force instead of snapping. It was imperfect, but it was resilient. That night, they ordered pizza. They sat on the garage floor, eating pepperoni slices from the box, staring at the monstrosity they had created. "It's hideous," Mark said, smiling as he chewed. "It's beautiful," Leo countered, wiping tomato sauce on his chin. "What are we calling it?" Leo didn't hesitate. He pointed a pepperoni slice at the yellow shark. "The Sarah Speedster," Mark choked on his pizza crust. He coughed, thumping his chest, and looked at the car. The Sarah Speedster. The name felt heavy and light at the same time. "She would hate that yellow," Mark said, his eyes stinging, but not from the onions. "She'd say it hurts her eyes." "She would love it," Leo said confidently. "Because it's loud." Mark looked at his son, then back at the car. Sarah was the noise in the house. She was the music, the laughter, the dropped pans. Since she died, everything had been so quiet. "Yeah," Mark whispered. "It is loud." If you've been touched by this story, remember to like and subscribe for more. And if you or someone you know is navigating grief, it's okay to seek support. Resources like the Grief Recovery Method or local support groups can help. You are not alone. Thanks for watching. Washington Park was a sea of puffy down jackets and steaming thermoses. The morning air was crisp enough to freeze your breath, but the atmosphere was hot with nervous energy. The hill, a long winding stretch of asphalt usually for joggers, was now lined with golden hay bales, turning the park into a makeshift raceway. I backed the truck up to the staging area. All around us, the competition was unloading, and it was intimidating. There were cars that looked like mini Teslas. Others looked like pencils, built for pure, drag-reducing speed. Tony S. Data Guy, I vaguely knew from PTA meetings, had actually built a car with flames on it. It had a fiberglass shell and looked like it came from NASA, not a suburban basement. I dropped the tailgate. Leo and I lifted the Sarah Speedster out. It definitely stood out. It was undeniably aggressively yellow. The paint job, still a bit tacky in the cold, was patchy where the aerodynamic ridges had pooled. The hand-painted shark mouth on the front looked less like a predator and more like a deranged cartoon. Against all the silver, black, and navy blue racers, our car was a highlighter explosion. "Whoa," Tommy said, wandering over with a juice box. He poked the side of the car. "Your car looks ... sticky." Leo puffed out his chest, adjusting his oversized goggles. "It's aerodynamic drag reduction," he said, solemnly repeating the nonsense I'd fed him during our painting session. "Like a golf ball," I smiled, checking the alignment of the front wheels. I knelt down, pulled a small oil can from my pocket, and lubricated the axles one last time, wiping away the extra with my thumb. I checked the lug nuts. I checked the knot on the steering rope. "Okay, driver," I said, my voice steady despite the butterflies in my stomach. "Helmet on." Leo strapped on the heavy motorcycle helmet. The visor clicked down. Suddenly, he looked so small inside that wooden cockpit. The shark car looked heavy and crude around his fragile little frame. The anxiety rushed back into my chest, cold and sharp. What if the rope snaps? What if a wheel comes loose at 30 miles per hour? What if he hits the hay and gets hurt? What if he loses and cries and I can't fix it? "Dad?" Leo said, his voice muffled by the foam padding. I leaned in close, putting my face near the visor. "Yeah, bud." "I'm scared." I looked through the plastic shield and saw his brown eyes, wide and trembling. The noise of the crowd, the cheering parents, the megaphone announcements, It all just faded into a dull buzz. "It's okay to be scared," I said, gripping the side of the car. "Being brave isn't about not being scared, Leo. Being brave is being scared and doing it anyway. What if I crash?" "The car is solid white oak. It's built like a tank." "I built it," I said, tapping the chassis with my knuckles. "It will hold you." "And if you crash, we pick it up, we dust you off, and we go get hot dogs?" "Okay. And Leo?" "Yeah, Mom is watching," I whispered, my throat tightening. "She's probably laughing at the paint, but she's watching." Leo smiled. I saw the crinkle of his eyes. He gave a thumbs up. "Heat 3, the announcer blared. "Leo Miller in the Sarah Speedster versus David Henderson in the Silver Bullet, Mr. Henderson." The engineer gave me a polite, pitying nod as we wheeled our cars to the starting ramp. His car was a marvel of aluminum and precision. The wheels were aligned with lasers. The suspension was stiff. The official waved the flag. Gravity took over. The engineer's car started faster. It was lighter with better bearings. It shot ahead by a full car length instantly. I stood at the bottom of the hill, my hands clenched into fists, holding my breath. I watched the yellow blur trailing behind the silver dart. Then the curve came. It was a long, sweeping left-hander, and right at the apex, there was a frost heave in the asphalt, a bump the city hadn't smoothed over. The silver car hit the bump first. Because it was built with rigid precision, a tight suspension, and a stiff aluminum frame, it didn't absorb the shock. It bounced. The front wheels chattered across the asphalt, losing traction. The car wobbled violently, scrubbing off speed as the driver fought to correct it. Then came the Sarah Speedster. It was heavy. I had used dense white oak, not pine. And the steering that rope pulley system was loose. It had slop. When Leo hit the bump, the car didn't bounce. The weight of the oak pinned it to the road. The loose steering absorbed the vibration without transferring it to Leo's hands. He didn't fight the curve. He just leaned into it. The weight of the car, the weight of the oak, the grief, the layers of yellow paint, the memories carried it down the hill with terrifying, unstoppable momentum. Mass times acceleration, the physics of heavy things. Leo shot past the wobbling silver car on the inside track. "Go! Go, Leo!" The scream tore out of my throat. It wasn't the measured voice of a contractor. It was a guttural, primal yell. I was jumping up and down on the grass. "Drive it! Go!" I wasn't the stoic widower anymore. I was a dad screaming for his son to fly. The yellow shark crossed the finish line 3 seconds ahead of the silver bullet. Leo didn't brake mostly because the brake was just a wooden lever rubbing against the tire end. He skidded into the run-out area, crashing gently into a wall of hay bales. Dust flew up. I sprinted. I vaulted the safety rope, ignoring the race official shouting at me. I ran to the car. Leo was already trying to unbuckle himself, flailing at the straps. He shoved the visor up. His face was flushed, his eyes bright and wild. "Did you see me?" Leo was yelling, the adrenaline making his voice high and shrill. "Did you see me? I passed him?" I hit the bump and I just went whoosh. I was a rocket. I was a shark. I reached down, grabbed my son under the arms, and swung him out of the cockpit. I lifted him high into the air, spinning him around. "You were flying, buddy." I laughed, and the sound felt strange and wonderful in my chest. You were absolutely flying. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more content that touches the heart. See you next time. They didn't win the whole tournament. The fairy tale ended in the semifinals, extinguished by a terrifyingly efficient vehicle driven by a girl named Maya. Her car was like an oversized skateboard in a fiberglass shell that hummed as it cut through the air. But as Mark loaded the Sarah Speedster back into the truck bed, securing it with ratchet straps, he realized the scoreboard didn't matter. The trophy was just a piece of plastic. The real victory was that the car was dirty. It was scuffed. It had grass stains on the black wheels and a new, distinct scratch on the yellow paint right near the shark's left eye. It was used. It had lived. The sun had dipped below the tree line, turning the Portland sky a bruised purple by the time they pulled onto the highway. The heater in Mark's truck rattled, a comforting, mechanical purr fighting off the evening chill. Leo didn't even make it to the first exit. He was fast asleep in the passenger seat, his head lolled against the cold glass of the window. His mouth was slightly open, and in his left hand he clutched a green ribbon that said "Participant" in gold foil. He held it with the same reverence you might hold a moon rock. Mark drove with one hand on the wheel, his other resting on the gear stick. He stole a glance at his son. There was a smear of safety yellow paint on Leo's cheek, a stubborn mark that spit and rubbing could undislodge. It glowed faintly in the passing streetlights. For the first time in 14 months, the silence in the cab didn't feel heavy. It didn't feel like a vacuum waiting to suck the oxygen out of his lungs. It felt peaceful. It was the silence of exhaustion, of a job done, of a memory made and sealed in the lacquer of the day. Mark kept his eyes on the road, watching the red taillights of the cars ahead blur just slightly. He thought about the geometry of his life before today. He had spent the last year trying to build a structure that was plumb, level, and square. He tried to sand down the rough edges of their grief, to organize their pain into neat, manageable piles like lumber in a rack. But life isn't a cabinet. You can't blueprint your way out of loss. Mark realized something then, listening to the rhythmic breathing of his son. He couldn't fix the sky. Sarah was right about many things. She was right about the yellow paint. She was right about the tacos, but she was wrong about that. The sky had cracked, and no amount of carpentry, no amount of bracing or structural reinforcement would ever seal that fissure. The hole she left would never be filled, not with wood, not with putty, not with noise. But he could build a shelter under that cracked sky. He could build a frame strong enough to hold them both. He could build a life that wasn't perfect, one that had slop in the steering and drips in the paint, but one that could absorb the bumps without shattering. He could paint it yellow, even if he hated yellow, even if it hurt his eyes, because that yellow made the world a little brighter for the boy sleeping next to him. He pulled into the driveway. The house was dark, a silhouette against the night. The motion sensor light flickered on, illuminating the garage door, the place where they had fought and cried and built something together. Mark turned off the engine. The truck ticked as it cooled, the metal contracting in the cold air. He didn't wake Leo right away. He just sat there for a moment in the dark driveway. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen glowing bright in the cab. He opened the photo gallery and scrolled back. Not to the recent photos of the car, but back 2 years. He found it, a video. He pressed play. On the small screen, Sarah was pushing Leo on a swing at the very park they had just left. She was wearing a scarf that was unraveling. She was laughing, her head thrown back, the sun catching the copper tones in her hair. "Higher, Mama, higher," Leo's voice chirped from the phone's tiny speaker. "To the moon, Bug. We're going to the moon," Sarah shouted, her voice clear and vibrant. Mark watched it. He felt the tear slide down the bridge of his nose, hot and fast. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't try to fix it. He let it fall. He let himself feel the ache, sharp and clean as a chisel cut. "We did good, Sarah," he whispered to the dark dashboard. "We built a fast one." He slipped the phone back into his pocket. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the truck-old coffee, sawdust, and the faint chemical tang of spray paint. He got out and walked around to the passenger side. He opened the door gently. Leo stirred but didn't wake. Mark unbuckled the seatbelt, the click loud in the quiet night. He slid his arms under the boy, one under the knees, one around the back, and lifted him. Leo was heavy. He was getting too big to be carried, but tonight, Mark didn't care. Leo buried his face in the crook of Mark's neck, his breath warm against the collar of Mark's flannel shirt. He smelled of sweat, autumn air, and hay. "Dad?" Leo mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "I got you," Mark said, shifting his weight to support him. "I got you." He carried his son up the walkway. They passed the bed of the truck where the Sarah Speedster sat, gleaming under the porch light like a promise. The yellow shark mouth seemed to grin at them. Mark unlocked the front door, maneuvering Leo carefully so his head didn't bump the frame. He stepped inside. The house was still quiet. The air was still. But as Mark walked across the threshold, carrying the weight of his son, he realized the house was no longer empty. It was full of them. Mark carried Leo up the stairs. The third step creaked, the one Sarah used to say was the house saying hello. Mark didn't wince. He stepped firmly on it. Hello, he thought. He reached the top of the landing, the wood creaking softly under his boots, holding tight to the only thing that mattered. Grief is a long road and there's no map. Sometimes the only way forward is to build something, not to fix what's broken, but to create a shelter for what remains. It's about finding the strength to paint a world yellow, even when your heart is blue. It's about realizing that winning isn't about the trophy, but about the grass stains, the scratches, and the memories you make along the way. If you're struggling with loss, please know you're not alone. There are resources that can help. Look for support groups, talk to a friend, or reach out to a professional. The journey is hard, but you don't have to walk it by yourself. Thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, and share if this story resonated with you.